Hi, Ron. Welcome to the Mind Blown Zone, episode 29. This one is called What Causes Rabies, AIDS, STDs, Hepatitis. Got a few good ones in there. How you doing, Brad?
Never better as usual. And that's the hodgepodge of the final list of primary questions I get when people are confronted with this idea that viruses don't exist. These are the last remaining uh, diseases that don't fit nicely into any categories that people ask about. So, want to get them all knocked out so we can move forward. What do you think?
Right, so it seems that no longer when people ask you, oh, yeah, well, what about this thing? Will you
Right.
have to offer any, one-to-one explanation? You can refer to videos each time.
That's right. I can't wait.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to read the bumper script.
Great.
Okay, so this podcast will cover a miscellaneous collection of so-called viral diseases that people commonly ask about when first confronted with the possibility that viruses do not exist. We've covered 9 other common alleged virus-induced diseases, previous podcasts, that fit nicely into specific categories. The remaining 4 here, rabies, AIDS, STDs, and hepatitis, are unique in both their presentation and explanations and require separate treatment. Okay,
Bingo.
and I believe the first one you're going to do is rabies.
Rabies, everybody's favorite. This is probably the most popular one that comes, and which is ironic because almost nobody knows anybody that had, let alone died of rabies. I mean,
Right.
I mean, ever really in the history of the world, not just today. And of course, people would say, "Well, that's because of the rabies vaccination." And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. And we'll try to explain that going in here. And this will be a neat one because I'll be able to explain Dr. Hammer's full this disease process, in the epicrisis in particular, which is the hallmark of rabies. So we'll start by going back to pre-Pasteurian age when people had a little bit more common sense and weren't completely propagandized in scientism. And prior to Pasteur, which is let's call it 1870 to 1890 when he was doing most of his damage. The actual name for this disease was hydrophobia. And most of us, even if we don't know even the slightest bit of Latin, can work out that that is fear of water, which is an interesting affliction to have, right? But what they had right was that it was a psychological condition. And we'll see in a minute here why and how they had this right. So it's kind of fascinating that that's what it was called prior to this rabies word. Of course, most of us know after watching Stephen King's Cujo and other various scare tactics, Old Yeller and so forth in literature, that it's supposed to be caused by a virus that's transmitted by a dog or wild animal bite or attack. And even in the height of Pasteur's fame, it was even suggested that a dog's saliva from a rabid dog or wild animal could allegedly transmit this supposed boogeyman rabies virus. So that was slightly interesting, although you wouldn't hear that today. More than likely.
Right.
So
a lot of these viruses have these very specific conditions. However, if viruses are inert and they're not alive and they don't die, and dogs are walking around everywhere and licking everything, and it's like these virus whatever's proteins or whatever or RNA things are just going to be scattered all throughout the world, right? And if they're viruses, you just come into contact with them, you're going to get it, right? It's going to sweep across the world, right?
yeah,
But
you
no,
would think.
it's only if you're attacked by a wild animal, only that.
Right. And of course the animal is supposed to be have the suggestion is that this rabies virus has gotten into the animal's brain and basically the animal has gone insane and it's just, prowling around, chomping and biting and attacking everything in sight. Right.
Right. And it's like drooling white gunky saliva.
Right. The hallmark of a rabid dog. And it's a lot like the word gravity, right? We use it in all sorts of situations such that, it's just become pervasive, right? When you think, somebody, he was a rabid such and such or whatever, right? She was rabidly insane about this, right? It's just become part of our lexicon today. right? To describe somebody who's just crazed, right? Just out of their minds. So that's how this one gets started. So what's interesting, there's so many interesting facts about this so-called rabies infection, though, in that the symptoms could present almost immediately, post-attack, or as many as 30, 40, or 50 years after the attack. So this one has a little bit of resemblance to AIDS in that you can be infected forever and never present with any symptoms. So that in itself should cause a little bit of head scratching. Like, how is that exactly? And of course, the story is that this non-living, non-thinking, non-will-powered virus somehow chooses to go through the bite wound and swim up into your brain through the blood-brain barrier and lodge itself in your brain for 40 years before it decides to come out of hibernation and finally attack you and kill you. So that's what you got to believe in the establishment story. But
a little bit of a stretch,
just a tiny stretch. So here are some of the symptoms, though. They're very bizarre, and it's erratic behavior, kind of hallucination-like recall of this attack that kicks in, and the person becomes incoherent, kind of rambling and fearful. They'll just start talking about this animal attack, and they can't drink fluid, and that's the fear of water ideas, right? They can't swallow, and this was where the hydrophobia, fear of water idea comes in. They also have seizures, so it's really just this person just starts to act in such bizarre ways, and the only thing about this bizarre behavior is that they're talking about this animal attack. And of course, can you think of anything more traumatic than being attacked by a wild animal, a bear or a lion or whatever, or a crazy giant big dog? You can't think of too many more scary experiences in life, right?
Well, simply the next door neighbor's Alsatian or German Shepherd just running at me and giving me a single nip that barely drew blood on the leg is still one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. So
right, there you
imagine
go.
some crazy dog just going at you for minutes and thinking you're going to die.
Exactly. And I've had a few myself. I won't relate them today, but yeah, I've had a few, and I can remember them. I can still remember vividly the fear flowing through my veins when this dog is coming at me. So it's very, very frightening. Very, very frightening. And this is something we should all know, that with trauma comes the idea of burying the trauma when it's too much to bear. Too frightening. And we'll talk about this in a second, about the disease phase and what Dr. Hummer talked about and learned when he figured out what he figured out. So I think I mentioned that, the latency for this virus going into your brain for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And there's a couple of really good stories. One of them is in Ethel Hume's book, Béchamp or Pasteur, in the rabies chapter. And it talks about two boys, same age, in Paris, who were out and about one day, and they were both attacked by the same dog and bitten up pretty good. And one of the boys, 2 days later, was to ship off to the United States to start his life. I mean, he was 16 or 17, and the other boy stayed behind in Paris. The other boy died of, quote, rabies within a week. And the other boy, who had similar injuries, similar bites, was fine, other than, the healing of the wounds and so forth. He was totally fine. He went to New York, and he lived there for 20 years. And before he came back to Paris, and he'd never heard what happened to his friend. The news had never gotten to him. When he came back to France and learned of the fate of his boyhood friend, a couple days later, he came down with the telltale hallmark signs of rabies or hydrophobia and started hallucinating and couldn't swallow and died of rabies a couple days later.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really interesting story. And in the Fauci's diary book, I can't think of the title right off the top of my head, but it was by the Princeton professor. There's a story in the end of that book, and it's about a man who, it's a story pre-Pasteur about a man who was attacked by a dog, and 30 years later, he's an old man at this time, and he just loses it in his home, and he's inconsolable, and you can't reason with him. And it's the same story. He's talking about this dog attack that happened 30 years earlier, and he can't drink water, and he can't swallow, and he slowly just wastes away and dies in his bed. So just a couple examples, like it's not some made up thing. So these are classic stories. Another point I wanted to make in the Ethel Hume book is that prior to Pasteur, she had looked in, and this book was written in 1920, by the way, so it was shortly after Pasteur died. And she pointed out that the amount of deaths across the countries in Europe that were tracking such things, had the healthcare administrative capabilities, England, France, and Germany in particular, that they had probably about 50 deaths a year were attributed to this hydrophobia or rabies. Now, after Pasteur came along and came up with his toxic vaccination nostrum, the death rose into the several thousands in each of those countries and eventually in America. So we went from 50 cases a year in the big countries in Europe to thousands and thousands of them in each country, along with America. So, and of course, the implication there is that the actual jab was the cause. And she also she documents stories of lifelong dog catchers, by the way, that have been bitten literally thousands of times by dogs. Many of them, crazed, rabid dog. And that was a profession back in the day, if you weren't. Are you aware of that, Matt?
I wasn't.
We literally had dog catchers. Even when I was a young boy, I think there was like a dog catcher in the town, and they would go out and get these, wild dogs off the streets. Anyway, none of these guys ever got rabies, which is pretty strange, right? A lot of the doctors in that era that, of course, were suppressed and not given a voice, suggested that it was the vaccine itself was, of course, the major cause of death. And the way that Pasteur made that jab will almost make you sick to your stomach, but he would literally take the brains and spinal columns of so-called rabid dogs, pull them out, grind them up in a blender, and then squirt them into bunny rabbits, squirt this into bunny rabbits' bloodstreams. And this is what he said, this is how he would attenuate it. So he would basically bring down the total strength of it, right? The potency of it by running it through the bloodstream of a rabbit and then drawing the blood back out of the rabbit. And that's the major component of a rabies vaccine. Basically rabbit blood. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. That's the rabies vaccine. And of course, the way that they used to give it was just crazy. It was all these shots around the abdomen, and you had to come back like 2 or 3 days in a row, and it was like 50 shots. It's one of the most torturous, barbaric things you could ever imagine. And how in the world Pasteur came up with this is beyond comprehension, that anybody would even buy it. It almost makes no sense at all. Of course, today's version of it still comes from those original Pasteurian concoctions, but I'm sure it's diluted to the point where it doesn't cause the damage that it used to. And that's similar to the HIV AZT concentration we'll talk about here in a little bit. But here are the key ideas about this, is that the GNM explanation for the disease process is there's basically 4 phases, if you want. There's the conflict active phase, which we've talked about in many previous podcasts, which is this is when you're issuing the fear, the judgment, the worry, the scare, the separation, whatever it is you're upset about. That's conflict active. When you get over that upset, you move into what's known as healing phase A, and that's when the psyche reverses the changes it made in the body, whether it's proliferating or necrotizing tissue. The psyche now goes about trying to change that back to the way you were before your conflict. And there's also a healing phase B that comes after what Dr. Harmer called the epileptoid or epileptic crisis, the epicrisis. And it's in this period known as the epicrisis when there is a change that's made in the brain. And for any of these conflicts and diseases, there's a change made to the brain relay that affects the particular organ or tissue or bone in the body. And during the epicrisis, there's an edema that forms, like a fluid around it. And when the epicrisis happens, that edema bursts, And this is the period of the epicrisis. And what's the most important part of this to explain is that it's during this process that you remember the conflict. So you effectively relive the conflict that you had. And typically this happens late at night, but it can also stretch on for many days at a time. And this is what I think this hydrophobia rabies really is that this person they come back to their trauma, whether it's the next day or 40 years later. And it's during this epicrisis, and this is when they are reminded of this traumatic attack. And what's explained by Carolina and Learning GNM is that it's a latent bite conflict. So we have a primal instinct to bite back, but we can't and we don't. And it causes this slack jaw of the person as they're reliving the event in the epicrisis. And this is known as paralytic rabies. So they're literally, the jaw and the throat are paralyzed as they relive and remember the trauma of the event. That makes sense?
Are you saying that the jaw paralysis happens after the epicrisis or during the epicrisis?
During the epicrisis.
Okay.
Right.
And why? Like one thing you said was like, oh, there's an urge to bite back, but we don't. Well, what do you mean by that?
Well, we're not. It's like it's this primal thing built into our base. Our basic constitution is that we have this self-defense mechanism, but we're incapable of biting back a dog. Right? We can't. Right? We can't compete with the dog. Right? So we don't. It's so fast.
That seems like a pretty silly idea.
Right. I mean, I'm sure you would do it instinctively if you were in a position where that was all you could do, right? If the dog was like holding you down by the neck or whatever, you might actually try that. But it's this instinctive desire to bite back that causes this slack jaw and the paralysis of the throat and neck area. That's the explanation. And that's the fear of water idea. They can't drink, right? Their throat is paralyzed. So that's the explanation.
Well, I mean, like, okay, so you say, the jaw, that seems like a muscular thing. Okay, you can't bite. Okay. But it doesn't seem like you couldn't take in water. It doesn't seem to fully block water intake.
It's that the throat is paralyzed is what happens during this process. I
isn't it that if you just like put water into the patient, they throw it up?
Yeah, it just doesn't go down, right? They can't. The swallowing process, right, doesn't happen.
Oh, so maybe my understanding is not complete. Like, if you put them on like what is it called, like a intravenous, right, an IV, you get water going into them that way. What happens with the water? So it's fine, goes in, stays,
right,
or it's thrown up?
No, that'd be fine.
Okay.
Yes, they can't drink or they can't eat either, but they can't. Obviously, the thing you need most is fluid or water, and they can't even get it down, right?
What do they call that? What if you just like cock their head back and pour the water down their throat? Doesn't it get like thrown back up?
I don't know. I've never seen this. I can't go that deep into it to explain to you what may or may not happen. But the person can't swallow. What do they call it? Peristalsis is, I think, the word. Or how the body moves things down through the throat, into the stomach, into the intestines, right?
Okay.
And there's something about this that's paralyzed, and the person cannot swallow during the epicrisis.
All right, they can't swallow, fine.
Yeah, and it's enough that, if that trauma was big enough, deep enough, long enough, that this would eventually kill that person is during the epicrisis. And to be clear, the epicrisis is seizures, heart attacks, aneurysms, strokes. So this is the epicrisis is a significant point in the healing process that if the trauma was great enough, if the conflict was long enough and intense enough, there's no way to get through this epicrisis period when this edema breaks in the brain. And you can see a lot of people die of heart attacks, strokes, aneurysms, seizures, etc. So it speaks to the intensity and duration of the conflict.
Okay. And what are some of the other symptoms?
That's it. These are the symptoms of the
Well, how do you die
person.
from
Yeah, they can't drink water. They can't do it. So, nowadays, I mean, who has ever had rabies in the last 100 years that anybody could even mention? Like, well, that guy died of rabies, right? But you've never heard of such a thing, have you?
it just seems like there must be something incomplete here because if the only thing is that you couldn't use your muscles to swallow the water, then someone could just pour water down your throat. But there must be something more to it.
Well, it wouldn't go down your throat. You could give them an IV and they would live. What I'm trying to suggest is that nobody dies of rabies in the modern era.
Okay. I was struggling to find it, struggling to see how anyone could die ever if all it was is that you couldn't actively swallow. It seems like you could passively have water poured down your throat.
I think it's the intensity of the epicrisis that also factors into it, right? So they go literally insane and incoherent.
Oh, okay. So it's okay, right, sure. So this is a secondary part of it, right? They're like, yeah, I've seen this on videos as well. Like they're completely delirious.
Right. They can't take care of themselves. They can't eat. They can't drink. And they're in another place and they're just gone. And this
Right. I
all,
mean, it must be an intense, like, there's like extreme fever and just delirium and just the whole body going absolutely insane, right?
I don't know
Physically and
about,
mentally.
yeah, I don't know about fever, but certainly they are incapable of taking care of themselves.
Okay.
And in 1850, in the random countryside, you call the doctor over and, Billy Joe's laying there in bed, incoherent and freaking out. What can the doctor do for him? Right? He's got the little black bag with the stethoscope and, in it, and some gauze. And, I mean, what can he do? They didn't have hospitals and IV stands and saline water bags and all the rest. So there was nothing they could do for that person.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
What the suggestion is that nobody today, right, would die of rabies. Would never happen.
Ah, okay.
If you got into that type of a situation, you would get rushed to the hospital. They'd put you on IV fluids. They'd sedate you until you worked your way through the epicrisis.
Right.
And that would pretty
So
much
people were only dying because they were just like, as you said, it was hydrophobia. Like all it is like this person can't drink water, can't drink, can't eat.
Well, that was what they called it. That was just the name they gave to it. That was one of the hallmark symptoms was they couldn't drink water.
Mm-hmm.
So that was why they gave it that name. But coupled with that was that basically they were going insane, is what it looked like,
Right.
as they talked about this traumatic animal attack. That was the only coherent thing they could talk about.
Right. Right. Yeah, I'm mainly reading with symptoms here like irritability, excessive movements or agitation, confusion, muscle spasms, seizures, weakness or paralysis, sensitivity to light, and fear of water. So it really doesn't sound like something that would kill you, right?
Right. As with most of these diseases that we end up talking about. But the
So
epicrisis.
is it more so?
Okay.
Oh, okay. Go into the epicrisis more, and then I'll ask.
Well, that is the one stage that kills people more than anything else. It's that moment between healing phase A and healing phase B when the trauma, the conflict is relived and the burst in the brain, right? That's a heart attack is really a brain attack, right?
Right, right. I see what you're saying. Ah,
So
okay.
there's some dysfunction going on in the brain, and as it tries to get back to the way it was, and if that trauma / conflict was too tremendous, then the change to the brain is too much. It's just too much to get back to the way it was, and
Right.
normal
So
function.
basically, this is an example of a horrific traumatic conflict that is so strong that it can kill you in the moment of the trauma release or trauma recovery or epicrisis, however you want to call it.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
That's what does it.
Right. And it seems like and then from there, some virus myth got created all around that.
Yeah, Pasteur.
Right.
He just made it up. That's basically the beginning of the virus lie, is rabies.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's it. This is it. This is the one.
Oh, is that one of the what? Was that the first vaccine?
It wasn't, well, smallpox and Jenner were really the first, right? But this is the one that gets everybody crazed. It's those two. It's smallpox and then rabies.
Right. Right. That was probably one of the first things that people really formed an association of this viral, like transferring of a viral thing, right? So this strong image of this dog with this foaming mouth, and it feels disease, like there's some bad thing in it
Right.
that it bites you and then you catch, right? It's
Right.
really easy to understand.
Right. And back in those days, right, there were a lot of dogs that, those dogs that have that appearance, right? Mange is a word they give for dogs sometimes in that situation. But most of the time, the dog was either, maltreated, abused, or poisoned. They'd put out a lot of poison for wild animals. People would put out in their, on their property, and dogs would come across it and, eat up this, poison for the skunks or the raccoons or whatever was destroying the property, and these dogs would eat it, and then they'd basically be poisoned and they'd just go crazy, along with potentially a wild animal. So that's your image, your Cujo image of the foaming mouth dog, right? It's just terrible abuse or poisoning. What causes that? Or malnutrition. They're literally starving to death. So that's rabies. Anything else there?
Well, I think that's pretty well explained.
Interesting. It's an interesting one. You can see that it's unique in its characteristics from all the others. So now we'll jump to the good old HIV/AIDS.
I'll just add one more thing. I think each of these viruses has like a difficult point to understand. It's like for me on that one, I imagine for a lot of people it's going to be like, well, how do you die? Right? It's like, how does it kill you then? Like,
well, this is true.
Each of the virus has like a difficult point to get over in understanding.
Well, this is true for cancers and a whole bunch of other things that allegedly kill us, right? Obviously, this epicrisis stage is a huge killer of people, right? This moment of epicrisis: strokes, aneurysms, heart attacks, seizures, right? Right. That's the causes for those are myriad, and it's all because of the intensity and duration of the conflict is what brings the actual death. That the body can't get over the changes it made to the brain. It can't reverse them. And that's what leads to those types of things. So you'll find with most diseases, what really kills you is a big mystery when you look carefully at it.
Right.
So these viral ones are no different. So as we dive into HIV/AIDS, right, most people know this story that have been around for 30 or 40 years, but this guy named Robert Gallo, he was a government, scientist / medical researcher. He was, and he was all through the 60s. He was trying to show how viruses cause cancer. That was his main work, and he got tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars worth of grants to prove this viral causation of cancer. And he was failing miserably in the 60s and 70s, and so he was one of the first guys wheeled out, of course, in 1984. During the Reagan administration, when he said he had finally found the cause of this deadly disease called AIDS. And he actually allegedly he's the only person to ever get a picture of the HIV virus. So that was 40 years ago. And no one's been able to see this thing since, which should raise a lot of alarm bells for most people. Why it doesn't, I can't explain. Even Luc Montagnier, who was credited as the co-founder, even admitted in an interview, I think in 2004, that the fact that nobody had ever been able to see or visualize, the HIV virus since was a big problem.
Right. Well, this guy's like as impressive as that guy that filmed Gravity in his barn in the 1700s.
Yeah, right. Can't remember his name, but absolutely right. This is what we're dealing with. These are our heroes from the establishment. Now, of course, for people who have done a little bit of research into COVID or anything, they've almost certainly stumbled across a guy by the name of Kerry Mullis, who mysteriously died September of 2019. He wasn't that old. I think he was in his late 60s. He won the Nobel Prize, I think in the late 80s, early 90s, for inventing the PCR test, right? Which is really it wasn't a test. It was a process basically to amplify small amounts of a certain substance in a sample. And this is what we now know, the COVID tests. And this is also a big player in the HIV test. But he's famous. If you could look around on YouTube and BitChute and other places, you'll find him talking about how he tried to get a grant for doing some AIDS research that was open to his group in the late 80s. And he started off the paper with the sentence, the HIV virus is the probable cause of AIDS. And he wanted to cite a scientific paper that proved that or showed that. And he couldn't find one. And he went around for a year asking everybody in the scientific community around the world for the paper that showed that HIV caused AIDS. And there was no paper. So he obviously didn't get that grant. And he talked about that till the end of his days, that this idea that there was this HIV virus that caused AIDS was just a complete, pure and utter speculation. There was zero proof of it. So worth a hunt for anybody curious about people questioning this HIV virus. Now, for those who remember in the very early days, I was young at this time, but there was this, before it was called AIDS, it was called GRID, believe it or not. Gay-related immunodeficiency was what they called it. And it came out of San Francisco Bay Area. And it was a couple dozen men who were all had several things in common, right? They were living what was called the fast track gay lifestyle. So they were regular attendees of these gay bathhouses in San Francisco. And they were having, multiple sexual partners every night, some of them anonymous. They were all IV drug users. So they were using illicit drugs. They all got very little sleep and had poor diets. And, perhaps, most importantly, they were all using something that was very new on the scene. It was called a popper. Amyl nitrate is what it was. Highly toxic and poisonous substance to humans. But it basically caused, I don't even want to explain it in any great detail here, but it caused them to relax. I'll just leave it at that.
I think it's going to be pronounced amyl nitrate. When you pronounce it amyl nitrate, it sounds a bit suspect, right?
Okay, amyl.
Just a guess, but it's just funny that it sounds a bit suspect.
Yeah, I gotcha. It does. If you follow that suspicion, it points to the value of them at the time. Anyway, they would huff them. It was like this really strong chemical in a bottle, and they would sniff it before they would go off and have their sexual relations. And it was just going, it was like crazy. Apparently there were all these magazines and newspapers for the gay community in San Francisco and New York and other big cities at the time. And these guys that made these poppers were paying for like all the advertising. They were, propping these magazines up. Well, it was the thing to do back in the early 1980s. And what's also interesting about all these men is they were all diagnosed with this, what's known as Kaposi's sarcoma. So they would get these big black splotches on their skin, like up in their chest and neck and face areas. And, we'll get into a little battle about now the terrain theorists versus the GNM teams here, right? The terrain theorists would suggest that they were just poisoning themselves, and they could very well be right. I think there's some truth to that. The GNM explanation is these men felt attacked in their rather rough excursions in these bathhouses. So hard to say who's right or wrong about that, but this was all of the AIDS patients all have these 6 things in common, which is pretty interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody else was randomly suffering this. And of course, the story would later be told that it's passed through blood and semen, and that was how you got it. It was the only place that the virus lived, which is a little strange. It's the first of its kind that, had that particular quality, right?
Oh, all these viruses have just these very specific places that they go or live or how they can be transferred,
Right. Dog saliva for the rabies, and now it's the blood or semen of a man, basically. And of course, that would later then, women could have it too, and on and on and on. But this is how the story progressed. So, very, very, very curious. I think I get into the big experiment. Yeah. Okay. So, of course, in those days, it slowly grew. They made up, this idea came up about an AIDS-defining illness. So in those early days, in the 80s, you could have it wasn't quite 10 yet. I think it was 3, then it was 5, and then 7, and it got up to like 9 in the 80s. If you had any one of these 9 diseases, like Kaposi sarcoma or hepatitis, then this meant you also, if you took this PCR test, then and it came up positive, you would then be defined as having AIDS. Now today, that list of AIDS defining diseases is 30 different diseases. All of these diseases were fully documented as separate diseases long before AIDS came along or HIV came along, right? So these are 30 diseases that existed long before AIDS. So they still exist today, but now if you get it and you have this positive AIDS test, now you have AIDS. And what's interesting about the HIV test, it's the only one of its kind in the world before or since where when you do the PCR test and it allegedly detects these specific HIV antibodies, it means you have the disease. Whereas every other test of any other viral disease, when you are found to have the antibodies, it means you're immune to the disease because you have the very things that are supposed to be able to fight it off. Make sense?
I'll have to take your word for it. I mean, I don't know.
Every other thing.
I understand what you're saying.
That's what the whole vaccination industry is about. Is they give you a little bit of the supposed virus, your body then develops and generates antibodies for it, and once they develop and generate the antibodies for it, you're supposed to be protected for life. That's the story.
Sure, I mean, makes sense.
Yeah, it's pure
So
nonsense.
if we just look, if I can just summarize what it seems to have happened here. I imagine there are a bunch of people that are having skin sarcoma, right? So sarcomas, whatever. Blotchy things on the skin, not looking good, and they're also probably feeling down and feeling bad and feeling sick. They go in, people, whatever doctors notice some sort of pattern, right? It's like, okay, there's these gay people that have like skin conditions and they're sick. Okay, they've noticed a thing going on here, right? But it seems what happened then is like there was this kind of like scope expansion or symptom identification expansion where it stopped being just this specific
That's right.
skin thing, and it started to be like, yeah, you got like skin things going on. It's like red stuff on your skin, like blotchy, bad skin condition, and also you kind of like feel down and depressed, right? And then they do a PCR test, and if you're, and they're not identifying a virus. They're doing a PCR test, and if you're positive, and it's like, yeah, okay, you got HIV. But this PCR test is like, yeah, you're basically in correlation with other people who have been diagnosed with having this. And it's probably, your body is producing specific things to help you cope with whatever conflicts are to do with skin conditions or like self-devaluation conflicts and like, what kind of like organs are associated with that? Like where you're just generally down and feel sick all over, right? Like central devaluation kind of symptoms, right?
Matt, it's all over the map, Matt. But I think, I think an attack conflict is central to it all, right? So that this feeling of potentially being attacked, right? This potential for you to be attacked by this HIV virus was enough to get the ball rolling.
Right. Yeah, like you're feeling like some sort of like sexual thing has invaded your body and you're like sexually soiled and feel grossed out and stuff like that. And maybe your body produces particular things to resolve that.
Yeah, well, in the late '80s up through the mid '90s, probably it was a risk to have intercourse for anybody. It did now allegedly spread to all walks of life. It was no longer just the homosexual community. It was everywhere and everybody, and so there was tremendous. Once again, we have this fear idea flowing, and suddenly everybody's scared of it. There's all thousands of stories out there about people who got HIV tests and were positive one day, negative the next day, positive the next day, right? They're negative the next day.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, tons of that going on.
Just going on the wrong day.
Yeah. So and we haven't done a podcast on antibodies. I haven't prepared for that, and it'd be a long one. But the short version of the story is as far as antibodies go, and we'll talk about this a little bit with hepatitis, is that these are antibodies are just basically, they do one of two things, right? This antibody is really just a globulin protein that it's either there for, it goes to a place where there's some sort of damage or restoration requirement or removal requirement, much like a bacteria would be in that presence. And its job is to either try to hold together cells that are breaking apart, trying to keep them alive a little bit longer, or
Right.
removing, this is why they're in the lymphatic system. They're removing excess dead debris, tissue, cells, so forth. That's what an antibody really is. So they're just there. So basically, if you've ever had a bruise before, right? You got punched in the arm, or you fell down and banged up your knee or whatever, and you have a big bruise on your arm or your leg or something, right? That bruise, if you were to stick a syringe in and suck out, the material underneath your skin there, it'd be loaded with antibodies. They're there repairing the damaged blood vessels that are, all black and blue. So that's the idea of what an antibody really is. But we could give a much bigger treatment of that. Anyway, this is the nature of this. So now all it takes is a positive test, and you can have one of 30 different diseases you're diagnosed with. And the list is so long, it's not even worth going over. But all those things meant you had the disease. So one of the things I wanted to point out was that, in the mid 80s, they actually did a full large scale test of over 1,000 AIDS patients. So these are men that were already diagnosed as having AIDS, and they took the PCR test. And only 37% of them tested positive for the HIV antibodies. 37%. Now, would you think, if you had even the least bit of common sense, that you would stop and say, wait a minute, maybe we don't have this thing right? 37%?
That's pretty bad.
Right? I mean, that 50% would have been a problem, right?
Well,
frankly,
anything less than like 99.
Yeah, anything, right? But 37%, and how this thing got shoved under the rug, and how this is the part that can't be explained, is how everybody just ignored it and went about life agreeing with the establishment. But that's the way things worked. So that's the story. But that should have shut the whole thing down right then and there. They said something's not right. The GNM explanation, I already touched on that, right? This attack conflict, just simply for being gay, right? They were frightened. Homosexuals, men at that time, were very frightened. The society at large, was looking at them as these these dirty, disease-carrying vermin. So they were frightened in and of themselves for that reason alone. So there's an attack conflict by itself.
Like, I imagine you're going to get some sort of symptoms. Like if you're, like, you have this feeling soiled on the skin conflict. But if everywhere around you is just telling you you're disgusting, you're going to have this like body-wide soiled conflict, right? Your body's going to be like, oh, the body's disgusting. We need to clean this whole thing.
Yeah, that's part of it. Remember that the attack conflict, though, is that you're defending, right? Your body your psyche tries to defend you from this virus outside of you that can come get you, and it tries to put a protection. It builds up the dermis layer of your skin to protect you from this threat from the outside. That's what's happening. Right. So it's not necessarily dirty. It's just the fear of being attacked by something.
Right, because there were like assaults and stuff. Like you'd be afraid that you're going to walk down the street and people are going to literally physically gang beat you up, right? Like lynch you. Imagine that.
Absolutely. So I'm not gonna dive too much further into this. A lot of people will then say, well, what killed everybody? And I think the short answer is the AZT, which was like 1,000 times more potent than it is in today's concoctions, today's HIV viruses. But this AZT thing, this drug, was the most deadly cancer treatment the U.S. government had ever tested. They tested it in the 60s. So toxic, it killed so many people that they actually just shelved it and said, this should basically never be tried again. But effectively, that AZT was a horrific poison. There's actually an interesting video. I don't know if I could find it or not. An interview of a guy who was, I think he was in France. And this was the late 80s, early 90s. And he was in an AIDS support group, people who were diagnosed. And he said there were like 30 or 40 people in his group, and only 2 or 3 of them chose not to take the AZT. and he was doing this interview in the early 2000s, and the only out of those 30 or 40 people, the only ones that were still alive were the 2 or 3 people that didn't take AZT. I thought that was a pretty telling, emblematic story of what caused a lot of the death.
You know, they're always reporting on the news like, well, the improvements in the AIDS treatments, right? They're getting better and better, more scientifically good, right? But I'll bet you what's happening is they've just become less toxic, like more and more towards no interference with the body.
That's right. Yeah, you don't hear of people dying of AIDS. When's the last time you heard of that? 20, 30 years
Right.
ago?
Like you look at Charlie Sheen and it's like, so this guy's just fine or something? Like,
Right.
I thought this thing was supposed to kill you.
Magic Johnson's one of the first stories that he didn't take the AZT, and he's been healthy and fine for 30, 40 years now, right?
So we're supposed to believe that the virus is just as aggressive and as ever, but because of the magical power of the drugs, it's like doing a better and better job to stop the unstoppable virus. All right.
Right.
So good that you can live until you're in your 80s.
Yep. That's the story.
Okay. Sounds legit.
Once you look at these things just a little bit, apply just a teeny tiny bit of common sense and critical thinking, you see none of these stories hold up. None of them hold up. And that takes us right into the next one. If we're done with AIDS, we'll go to the STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, right? Everybody always has a question or two about these. So we'll start out with herpes, which is,
always asking for a friend, right?
Yeah, asking for a friend. The herpes is a more common one today than the next two we'll touch on. But this, so there's 2 types. There's this facial, and then there's the genital. And so the facial is a separation conflict. Anything that happens in the skin, right, is some form of wanting to separate or not wanting to separate. So it can also be a feeling soiled or violated conflict, which is the deeper dermis one we've talked about several times in our virus podcast. So it could be just as simple as missing a kiss from a partner or not wanting to be kissed by your partner. Another example is cigarette withdrawal. Somebody who's got that oral fixation, they can develop it because they want that cigarette. And another example is, of course, being asked by your partner to perform oral sex, and you're disgusted or repulsed by it, but you do it because you want to please your partner. So those are some examples of how facial herpes can happen.
Yeah, I knew this girl in a social group years ago, and the other girls in the social group would be like, "Yeah, she has herpes. She's got herpes."
Right.
And I'm like, okay, she must have contracted the herpes kissing virus at some point, and she has to warn people not to kiss her because it will transfer the herpes to them. But as you said, point C, missing a kiss from a partner, I realized she had this conflict about this guy who she thought she was meant to marry or something like that, but he was off in another country and they were separated and broken up. There you go. What a coincidence that was there.
There it is.
Yeah. What a coincidence, right?
Yeah. And just like all of those, if you know somebody that had herpes but doesn't have them anymore, right? Just kissing them, you can scare yourself into that attack conflict, soiled conflict, right?
Right, you're going to get a soil conflict instead. And, seeing as all these skin things look pretty similar, you must be like, oh, same thing, just transferred.
Right. Classic. So the genital is a sexual separation conflict, and more commonly, it's wanting to separate. But it could be sexual rejection, revulsion, disgust, abuse, or just plain old repulsed by what's going on. So it just disgusting acts, disgusting odors, disgusting behaviors, anything you're repulsed or disgusted by can kick it in. Loss of a sexual mate can cause it. Fear the sexual mate is having sex with somebody else can cause it. And of course, again, not wanting to perform a sexual act the partner wants you to perform, but going ahead with it. You're disgusted or repulsed by it. So very similar to the facial, but that's obviously the genital region relates to sexual activity. And as usual, you get the the separation desire is the epidermis, and the soiled, grossed out, attacked is the deeper dermis layer. Make sense?
Right. Okay.
Syphilis. So this is, believe it or not, this used to be called the great pox. So we had chicken pox, smallpox, and great pox, of all things. And once again, there's no difference between herpes and syphilis. This is a sexual separation conflict, typically wanting to be separated. Can also come from being rejected by a partner, or forced abstinence can also kick this in. Not wanting to be separated, but forcing yourself to, or being rejected.
Now, this syphilis one, it seems like, I don't know, wasn't there some like, I don't know, what is the word that's like pandemic, but just in one country?
An epidemic? Yeah, epidemic.
Like, wasn't there some syphilis epidemic in Germany in the 20s or something like that? Is that a thing?
Well, probably. That was when Berlin was being debased and all the disgusting behaviors were happening there. So that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm not familiar with it, but rings true to me. There were some disgusting things happening in Berlin there in the 1920s.
So what are the symptoms of syphilis?
Well, it's
great pox. And where? All over your body, or it's sexual, or what?
Yeah, no, rashes, lumps, and bumps in the genital region.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah. It's basically the same thing as herpes.
Okay.
Now, gonorrhea and chlamydia, a little bit different. This are territorial marking conflicts, which means that basically you feel like someone is intruding on your territory. That's what would kick this in, and that I think you could say, if you thought your partner was cheating on you, it could be caused by that. But these can also be kicked in by having ejaculation problems for men, and apparently just general wear and tear from too much sex in a short period of time can also bring on these symptoms. So that's STDs in a nutshell.
Lovely.
And by the way, yeah, crabs are real things. So yeah, those are actual real things. There's no need to talk about that. They aren't viruses, and they aren't psychological conflicts. They're actual critters. Lice, shall we say. All right. So here's the last of the bunch here. This is the least asked.
Hold on. Just one question. So with these STD ones, there's always a tendency, like, to attribute, like that's viruses, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to be something in society where there's this noticing that it seemed to be like, it happened after being with that person or something like that. Like, I think people. Do you think there's any credibility to this noticing that it was like after this person, then symptoms appear, and just to give, why is it makes so much sense to people that this one's viral?
I'm not sure I follow your question. I mean, during that sexual encounter, right? There was something about that encounter that bothered you in some way.
Sure, but people aren't noticing this, right?
Well,
they're just like, oh, got this, must have caught it,
They don't notice it as a causative factor, but they would certainly notice during the the sexual encounter that they were disgusted, revolted, repulsed, felt rejected, felt like they were being cheated on, right? Felt maybe you were the one doing the cheating, right? And you felt guilty about having sex because you could pass something on to your real partner from your mistress or whatever, right? So there's a little bit of that. So that's it. All that's going on during sex. You're not thinking about that having any causative relation.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So then it seems like there's you have the negative association with the person. You can't consciously sense it, but there's some sort of negative association with the person. Then you're noticing the symptoms. Right. You just tie the two together. Plus, you also know from society that all these symptoms of all sorts of stuff is viral. So you just start to make that connection that it's transferred by touching and stuff, right?
Right.
Just the touching.
Fluids, right? I think when people think these viruses travel in fluids, right? That would be the main thing with the STDs. There's this fluid transfer.
Right. Because you're closer than you normally are to a person, right?
Right. I mean, let's face it, we've all been trained that sex is dirty, right? It's a dirty act.
Right.
Even in the full throngs of, massive marital love, there's still this sense in the back of our minds that there's something dirty about it. So that word dirty, obviously covers, multiple meanings.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In the figurative sense and the literal sense. So there you go. It's all the meaning you assign to the situation brings on the what really, in these STDs really are just skin problems is really what they boil down to, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean,
One
most of them seem to be just feeling soiled on the skin or separation of the skin. That covers most of them, right?
Right. And if you go back and look into the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, and even into the early 1900s, you know what the treatment for all these sexually transmitted diseases were? The primary treatments?
Well, tell me.
They were ointments, of course. A balm or an ointment you would rub onto the afflicted area that contained mercury or arsenic. Now imagine that.
Wow, how do people come up with these ideas? It's almost like they're projecting their negative association of sex onto wanting to punish the person or something like that.
Well, in fairness, those ointments were all kinds of skin problems or whatever, right? In fact, my mother even remembers her mother using something called mercurochrome. It was like a jar.
That sounds wonderful. Imagine trying to market that these days.
Yeah, it was like a jar of Noxema. If you know what like those little Noxema jars looked like, I know those little blue jars. It was like kind of almost egg shaped in a way, but yeah, it was just this lotion that had certain percentage of mercury in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are two of the most toxic substances to humankind, arsenic and mercury, and that's what they were rubbing.
Although these days I do question if ideally those two things are even toxic. Like,
well,
would Jesus,
yeah,
or the Buddha be affected by those? I question that.
Yeah, well, that's a big
for another time.
Question for another time. Yeah, we won't get into that. But yeah, this is something that just exacerbated the symptoms, right? Imagine rubbing mercury on your rash / pox, sensitive down in your genital area. I mean, how can that possibly help? I don't think it can. It made it worse, almost certainly. So you can imagine the horrors of having syphilis or gonorrhea back in those days, right? You were rubbing poison onto your genitals every day to get rid of it, just making it worse.
Is this after they deemed that to be a poison or before?
I think it's always been known as a poison, but there was some convoluted thought process that it would kill the bacteria or virus or microbe that was, in your skin. I think that was the prevailing idea.
Genius.
Yeah, and obviously, when's the last time you heard of someone who had syphilis or gonorrhea? I mean, nobody has these anymore, right? How did that go away, right?
Well, the last time I heard about it was on Seinfeld.
Was it on Seinfeld? I don't even remember that.
Yeah, they just talked about it. Yeah, she called gonorrhea from a tractor.
Oh, is that right?
I don't know if you remember. It's some weird, strange joke that it takes the episode to explain. But when have I heard it outside of that? Never.
Yeah, that one's a little different than the syphilis and herpes, but yeah, but syphilis, yeah, nobody gets it anymore. But somehow or another, it was this horrific scourge, 150 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But people ask about it all the time. What about herpes? What about syphilis? So had to cover it. So those are the STDs. We got them all knocked out. There is an explanation, believe it or not, for all these things, and the explanations make sense. So the last and final one that's the least, I get asked the least, but I get asked enough that I wanted to cover it, and that's hepatitis. And this is, of course, an AIDS-defining illness, for the record, one of 30. And, of course, according to Dr. Hammer, this is the healing phase of a territorial anger or unable to digest conflict. And I think I've talked about this before, but everything that hits in the abdominal region is anger related, or you're unable to digest a situation, right? You can't stomach something. You can't, you had to swallow it, but you can't accept it. Basically, that's what lands in the abdominal region. And of course, hepatitis specifically points to the liver.
Right.
And this is anger, oftentimes recurring. Hepatitis is oftentimes it's a chronic situation, right? It's a hanging healing in GNM terms, and just fights with spouse, partner, coworkers, schoolmates, whatever, right? All these types of things that flare up, flare down, can bring this up and down. And of course, there's a biological purpose to all this, right? We've talked about the separation and attack conflicts, and the purpose. The purpose of this is to widen your bile ducts to improve your ability to digest. So basically,
So what is the association of the bile ducts with the liver?
They're connected to the liver. That's how the liver delivers its enzymes to the stomach to assist with digestion.
So the liver is connected to the stomach by the bile ducts, and through the bile ducts goes some
bile
bile.
Yeah.
Which is for what purpose?
It's digesting food.
So the liver creates the bile?
Oh yeah, I think so. Yep.
And then it puts it into the stomach, and the bile is used. Okay. Right. All right. I generally don't know this specific stuff.
Yeah,
sorry about that to anyone listening. But a lot of people listening probably are like, wait, I don't know either.
Right. Good question, as always. So yeah, that's just some deep biology there. But yeah, that's the idea: is you can't digest something. You're just, I can't handle this situation, right? I can't accept this situation. I can't digest it. And your psyche saying, oh, you can't digest something? Well, let me help you out by giving you a little bit more bile to help with your digestive process.
Okay, so you're saying it's widening the bile ducts. Okay. Well, how wide are the bile ducts? Do you know that?
No, I don't. We're talking, fractions of millimeters, probably.
Small. Okay, so they're small. Okay, so I'd
I
always imagine the bile ducts are like an inch or something like that.
No, I was suggesting the amount that they were widened by. I don't know what the width is. I'm just saying it would be, it would be a tiny amount, just a little bit. It happens over time. But the more you have the conflict, the wider they would get.
Right. And I imagine the liver itself is also kicking into a higher gear to produce more bile, or just do other processes more, right?
Perhaps, right? I think the idea is just to get more bile into the stomach to help you with digestion, right? Into the intestine and stomach to help with digestion. So that's the basic function of them. So you can get over your indigestible morsel situation, as Dr. Hammer would call it. And imagine how many people have these indigestible situations in their lives, right? It's a big number. It's not a small amount of people. So this is effectively an anger conflict. Now, what's tricky about hepatitis is that they claim, based on antibody tests, and this is, again, I don't have time to go into all of this. You have to get into some deep weeds to unpack and point out the absurdity of this. But when they do a test of somebody for hepatitis, there's this A through E antibodies, A, B, C, D, and E. And this is why there are different types of hepatitis based on the shape and morphology of the antibodies that they find.
Right. So they're like, we find different antibodies, and therefore there must be different viruses as well.
That's exactly right. That's exactly how they do it.
Packet geniuses. Having never identified any of the viruses, they're just like, okay, well, it's just more things that they must exist. I mean, how could you get different antibodies without different viruses? There's no other explanation.
That's right.
And I suppose what these are really pointing to is different varieties of conflicts.
Well, I mean, that follows that theme. Sure, there can be all kinds of things around that theme, right? But really what it comes down to is you are in a situation that you don't want to be in, is effectively what the overarching theme is.
Right.
So, there's 1,000 different ways you could, you could come up with all different kinds of examples of this. It's really endless. But effectively, you're angry. That's what hepatitis is really related to. It's some sort of anger.
It's funny how they managed to suggest that hepatitis is viral. Like with the STD one, it seems like, oh yeah, go touch, and then you get it. But hepatitis, the liver, specifically the liver, has contracted somehow a virus.
That's right. It's just sitting there in your liver for some strange reason.
And where do they suppose it comes from outside? Like, I've heard him say there was a hepatitis this or that outbreak by something in some food,
I I
that
I
was bad.
think it's related to hypodermic needles is a big way they say you can pass this around, which is why it's also, an AIDS related illness. I think that's how you can, they say that this, intravenous drug users and so forth are prone to hepatitis. But they're different. There's the A through E, so there's a wide variety. And there's zero value in understanding whatever their, explanations are because, of course, viruses don't exist. So we can throw it all out
Right.
as some sort of a fluid that gets into your body and attacks your liver and everything else. It's the same old story. So that is my coverage. I'm not going to talk about any more of these viral diseases. I think we've covered all the major
Your
ones.
life milestone complete. Reached.
Yep. Get it out of the way. Now, whether people accept the explanations or not, that's another thing. But of course, you got to start with, what we went over in the virus podcast, which is that nobody can find any of these viruses in the fluids or tissues of a sick person. It's never been done. I can't do it.
Right.
And if for some reason they could do it or claim they can do it, then, well, let's put that aside. So they can't do that. So now we come to their, manufacturing methods where they, either get one from the monkey kidney cell killing, right? The cytopathic effect with the antibiotics. Now they have these little particles in the bottom of the test tube. They don't take these particles and separate them from everything else and then, introduce them to other creatures and give them these specific diseases. That doesn't happen either. So they're 0 for 2. And they don't assemble any viruses with their sequencing methods either and take their final assembled product that they can slap together on their computer screens. They aren't able to do that in the lab and create the virus to then go and scientifically prove that this thing that they created goes and harms people. They can't do any of these things. And yet, people will fight me tooth and nail on these explanations that I provided, like how they aren't right or how they don't make sense. And the fact is, what doesn't make sense is the virus story. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
They've proven nothing. They haven't even come close to proving anything, which should be the end of the discussion. But hopefully, with all these explanations, coupled with the absurdity of the story of the virus, we could put it to rest for people that listen to our podcast, which I hope happens. I don't know. What do you think, Matt? Crazy?
No.
Convinced?
I think the viral delusion is mega crazy. Just the readiness for people to believe in something where they've never seen it before. They're just taking the word of someone else. Just what shocks me every time.
Yeah, that's what our society's built on, right? Our society's built on experts that believed what they were taught, and then we believe what our experts were taught. We're all believing stuff. That's what it boils down to. And for the few people who decide to get curious and look into it for themselves and ask the question, how do I know this is true? The fact that 1,000 experts say it's true doesn't mean that doesn't, I still don't know that that's true, right? That's just what 1,000 experts say. So once you decide, I'm going to find out whether this is true or not, this is when you start to uncover these absurdities. And there are many.
And it's a very good life moment, because like up until that kind of point, people, it sounds absurd, but people never really taught how to figure out whether something's true or not, right? Like,
Yeah,
unless you did
do you need to be taught it though, or are you kind of come in hardwired to figure it out for yourself?
I don't know, but the only subject in which you're really taught to figure out how things are true is kind of like mathematics. That's the only
Right.
thing where the teacher's like, okay, devise a proof for this, and you have
Right.
to actually reason your way to proof.
Right.
Like if you don't do that kind of thing and you don't know how to apply it to reality, what are you going to do? Like you don't really know how to like pass this like rigorous like ironclad logic over all your observations and what people have told you. Check for
Right.
contradictions.
And it's difficult for, and if you haven't heard the people that demonstrate the lack of evidence for viruses, if you haven't listened to them, you'll easily be tricked and fooled, because the trick word isolate and isolation, which we talked about in the virus podcast, that one will throw you for a loop unless you go read the methods section and then you go, wait a minute, and what part of these methods do they isolate the virus? You know, you scratch your head a little bit, but then of course you have all the experiments with the, you know, the injecting of fluids into the helpless rodents, which seem to allegedly show this germ theory, virus, bacteria causes disease situation. If you don't know
Right.
how to think that one through, you can be easily fooled.
Yeah. Like a lot of the things the medical establishment shows are like stuff that seems to indicate it. All right. But not fully. Like you have to dig deep to find the contradiction. And if you don't really dive deep to find the contradiction, well, it seems like there is no contradiction.
Right.
You only know the contradiction's there once you find it.
Right.
Before that, seems to make sense.
Yeah. You've got to think. You've got to be able to step away and say, I need to know how this is true. Like, no one's going to tell me that it's true. I want to see for myself how this is true. That's the starting point. And, you know, perhaps
Right.
assume that it isn't true. It's neither true or not true. You don't know. You need to see that evidence. And then you can go look at the Johns Hopkins guinea pig experiment with tuberculosis, which is ludicrous. We talked about that on the last disease podcast. Or you can go look at these literally thousands and thousands of things where they inject rodents, but they never can seem to cause any damage with, you know, airborne or waterborne or foodborne transmission of any of these things. Saying, well, that's awfully curious, because that's how we're all supposed to catch these things, right? Why do they got to inject them into all these poor little helpless mice and rabbits? A little strange, isn't it?
Well, it's beyond that.
So yeah, there you go. That is the end of the virus talk. And we've covered all the biggies. And we'll let people sit and think about, are these explanations plausible? Do they make some sense? I think they make a lot of sense. Are they right? You know, I don't know for sure whether every single one of these explanations is 100% right. But what I do know for sure is that no one's ever demonstrated that viruses exist. So there has to be another explanation. And these are the best ones I've seen.
Mm-hmm.
So there we have it.
You know, the point where you get to first doubting and then being really like, yeah, I guess these virus things are pretty suspect. It's kind of like one of the bridges to, you know, this to being ready for this take your power back course.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because before that point, you're 100% in on materialism. You're 100% in on all causation comes from the Big Bang and created all these different physical items that rummage around and do certain stuff, right?
Right.
You know, on the other side of that is like, wait a tick. Like consciousness exists as well. That's something. There's something there. Maybe it's causal. And that's kind of like the area of philosophy that's required almost to go into take your power back.
Yeah, it does come down to that. You know, if you were to understand that, and this is it's a huge what this all points to is how devastating and damaging fear is, and what it can do to your judgment as well. But most of this stuff is some sort of fear related situation. All these viruses, right? You're fearful of an outside world that can attack and harm you.
Yep.
And that is incredibly disempowering. Just look around at all the people that are still behaving irrationally when it comes to COVID.
Right.
After all these years, they still can't see it, but they're frightened. That's the very nature of the things that they do is stemming from fear. And of course, if you're fearful, that means you are giving your power away at the core to something outside of you. And we're suggesting the exact opposite is the truth. And
I would say that after you go through take your power back, you basically cannot get these symptoms that are generally attributed to viruses.
Yeah, for the most part. Right?
For the most part. Like, some things can sneak through, but you're basically, like, empowered, and you just cannot get sick in that way anymore.
Well, yeah, it's going to be short duration, short intensity, right?
Yeah.
You're going to see it pretty quickly. Oh my gosh, yeah, that's right. I snapped last night and went through this, that, and the other thing, and I didn't see it at the time, but now I do. And nips it in the bud, and so it's a short illness, and back on your feet in no time. So, absolutely, that's the benefit. Or you could stick with the establishment explanations.
Have fun.
Your choice.
Just get sick all the time. Be a victim. Like, when the next COVID rolls around, contract that. Get the vaccine. Have fun.
There's literally
just live it up.
Zero benefits to believing the establishment. There's zero. Other than going along to get along.
Yep.
That's the only benefit. If you want to call that a benefit. All right, my man.
Okay, I guess that does it. Brad's
Appreciate
free of explaining viruses. So
That's
congratulations, Brad.
We got them out there. I'll be able to post these up for posterity, and anyone who says, what about, I'll point them to one of these podcasts that'll cover 99% of the questions. Hooray, hurrah. Well, thanks for all your great questions as usual, Matt, and introspection. And we're about to get a lot more spicy with our podcasts. I think the times are calling for it. But we're going to continue to delve deeper into this realm of taking your power back, not giving it away, and seeing internal causation versus external causation more clearly than ever as we proceed. Can't wait.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks, Brad. Thanks,
awesome.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Thanks, Matt.
Bye-bye.